welcome Kalimera, as they said in the Greek language at the time of Jesus. Ron Allen, coming under the auspices of West Street Christian Church, part 17 of a series of studies of the Gospel of Mark with an eye toward how this narrative of Jesus might relate to our moment in history, especially as we consider the changes in our circumstance that have come about as a result of COVID-19. Tonight, I have two passages in view. The first one in particular may seem a little odd because it is Jesus interacting with the disciples on the subject of divorce. I think this is an important topic even for the time in which we are, because there are people, probably you know some, you might be one, who are still troubled by the idea of divorce. What do we make of divorce from the standpoint of God's view? How does the church react to the issue of divorce? But I think it is also of importance because divorce in this text can be a kind of symbol for commitment in all arenas of life. We'll see how that can be so as it unfolds. But I think there is a sense here in which the issue of divorce raises for us important questions about to whom we commit, for how long do we commit, what happens when we feel like something in the relationship has gone amok. And then there is a short instance afterwards in which Jesus blesses some little children and says, "Let the little children come unto me and do not hinder them." So thinking about that first passage, which occurs in Mark 10, verses 2 and following, we find some Pharisees coming to test Jesus, and they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Two things. One, this, of course, is a caricature of the Pharisees, but while it is a caricature, the interaction they have here is also characteristic of the time in which religious leaders would engage with one another in public conversation about what are the most authentic aspects of belief and which ones are less so. How should a person and a community live, behave in response to the initiatives and guidance of God, and how should they not? And there was in that day, as in our own, a considerable debate over how to answer these questions. And number two, the Pharisees here are depicted, as Mark usually does, in a negative caricature, probably more rigid than they would have been in real life. But this is partly a part of the controversy between the Pharisees and the Markan community that took place about the time Mark was written, some 40 years after the resurrection. The question, is it lawful for a person to divorce his wife, is one to which the reader knows the answer. Yes, there are reasons for divorce spelled out in the first 39 books of the Bible. And Jesus answered them by reminding them of this very fact. Moses, what did Moses command you? Note that Jesus here does not immediately go on the assertion in taking the initiative, but he asks a question, which is a real question, which opens up space for people to interact with one another in meaningful ways, rather than just shoot barbs at one another. And they answer rightly. Moses allowed a male, to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her. It seems that there were certain things that the authors of the first 39 books and the rabbis by the time of Jesus considered that were impossible for some couples to overcome. So a man did have the right to put away a woman, and it was much more heavily on the male side than on the female. That is, the man had more freedom in these regards. The idea is that, well, we'll come to that in a moment. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. That is, from Jesus' point of view, as represented in the Gospel of Mark, God conceded, C-O-N-C-E-D-E-D, God conceded to a human weakness, namely the hardness of heart, in allowing divorce. Hardness of heart, of course, is a phrase that is associated with Pharaoh and the time of the Exodus, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And the idea in this phrase is that the person whose heart is hardened is a person who is unteachable. For the Hebrews, the heart was the same as the motherboard of the self, the operating center of the self. It wasn't just a source of feeling or romance. It was the place from which the human being gets his or her fundamental orientation. And here, Jesus says, God didn't intend for divorce, but God accommodated to human unteachability, that is, the inability of people to learn to live with one another, learn to live with one another in the way that God intended. But from the beginning, Jesus says, God made them male and female. Here, of course, Jesus is quoting Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, two things are noteworthy relative to this discussion. The lesser one first is that, relative to this discussion, the lesser one first is that male and female are created equally. At the outset, there is no hierarchy. Hierarchy develops only after the fall. And secondly, the man and the woman are joined together in a covenantal relationship so that the husband and the wife living in marriage and the household they create is to be a covenantal community in the same way that God entered into covenant with Israel, and in the same way that Jesus points to the realm of God as extending covenant to all times and places. In a covenant, you make promises to stay with one another. There are provisions for violation so that the covenant can continue. And the essence of covenant is mutual support, that the members of the covenanting parties enter into an agreement whereby they will do what is necessary to maintain the life-giving characteristics of the community: husband, wife, household, Israel. And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The idea behind one flesh is that when the man and the woman, the husband and the wife, come together, the act of coming together creates a unity of responsiveness between them. It isn't that they become the same. It is that in responding to one another at the deepest ways, they become ultimately mutually supportive within the confines of the age in which we live. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And now Jesus says something very clear and very hard. What God has joined together, let no one separate. And this line is often used in weddings because, on the positive, it points to the deep bonds of commitment one to another that have their origins in God. But it is also troubling because it allows no abrogation. And this continues. They went in the house, and the disciples asked him about this matter. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her." And the penalty for adultery, of course, is being marginalized. I know there was an earlier period in Israel's history when divorce was punished by stoning, but that was not actively practiced, so far as we know, at the time of Jesus. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So the point is, stay together. If the marriage for some reason falls apart, don't remarry. Marriage, from this point of view, is one person for a lifetime. If the marriage should come apart and you marry again, then you have violated one of the fundamental principles of marriage relationship. It's the same as committing adultery, which is sufficient to eliminate one's participation in the realm of God. This is, as I say, quite a hard saying. And it was so hard that by the time Matthew wrote the same words, he added a phrase. Therefore, if God has joined together, let no one separate. That much is the same. And Jesus said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another, comma, except on the grounds of unchastity, that is, if one of the partners has been sexually unfaithful, comma, commits adultery. Between the time of Mark and between the time of Matthew, the church, in ordering these materials, added that phrase because the Markan version proved too strict. And I think this is a way of saying Mark wanted to deal with people who were unteachable. Matthew wanted to deal with people who, in relationships, found themselves unable to adapt to the other. That is, they had a certain hardness of heart. Matthew wanted to provide a means of grace for them to be released from a situation which they found almost too great to bear. Following this situation, and churches can take a clue from this with regard to the marriage relationship and divorce. This is not a celebration of divorce, what I'm about to say, but it is an acknowledgement that some relationships, whether for lack of effort or other qualities, some relationships just don't work out. And most churches, Christian Church Disciples of Christ being one of them, acknowledge that it may be better for both parties, for their relationship, and for the contribution they make to the world, to draw that relationship to a close, and for each to pursue his and her way in the world more independently. This is not intended to make checking in and out of marriage as easy as checking in and out of a hotel, but it is to acknowledge that there are some sticking points that are almost beyond our capacity to negotiate. And as I said earlier, in this passage, in a way, divorce functions as a kind of figure for relationships generally. When we enter into covenantal community, we make a commitment to be mutually supportive. And that's not something you just walk away from the way in which you walk away from a hotel where you spent the night. When you make a commitment, you make a commitment. And that can mean riding the crest, riding the good things, but it can also mean struggling together through the hard things. And if my experience is any guide, often the experience of struggling together actually can deepen the sense of mutual accountability, the sense of mutual support, the sense of mutual witness. And even if you reach the point that you can no longer stay together in a marriage, in a church, in wider communities of involvement, then the separation should be one of respect and compassion for the other, and not finger pointing, blaming, power grabbing, that sort of thing. And this relates to the next little passage where some people are bringing children to Jesus in order that he might touch them. Probably this is a reference to the practice of rabbis blessing children at a very small age, very much like we at West Street do when we bless small children and infants and offer parents the opportunity to dedicate themselves to raising the child with values and practices that are consistent with those of God. The disciples, however, and remember the disciples are often anti-heroes in this book, the disciples try to keep them away. They forbid them to come. And that's when Jesus actually becomes indignant and says, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for to such as these belong the realm of God." In that world, there is a very different point of view than one that animates so much of ours, and that is the view of children. Of course they respected children. Of course they recognized that children were the future of the community. Of course, they raised children in the knowledge of the Torah and to be mutually responsible members of community, but children were still, in a certain way, at the bottom of the social pyramid of antiquity. And so Jesus is here saying, using the child as a symbol, everyone can come to me. Everyone can become a part of the movement to the realm of God, even and perhaps especially those who are on the bottom of the social heap and who have been denied freedom, opportunity, dignity, abundance. And then Jesus says, "For it is to such as these that the realm of God belongs." That is, the realm of God offers to those who have been denied in this life an opportunity for God to make things up. And the realm of God also offers to those who have been a part of the good things of this life in a godly way, the opportunity to join God in becoming an agency of blessing for the children, for those who are on the underside of the world. We are in a moment when there are many people who find themselves on the underside of life. Disease, unemployment, financial issues, uncertainty about the future. The Gospel of Mark, as I have said so many times, wants to assure the community that there is a power at work in the world under the aegis of God that wants to provide opportunity for love, for peace, for joy, for living in community, for covenant, for mutual support, material abundance for all. We in the church need to figure out ways of joining with that movement. Of course, there are standards, but if the church can find a way to incorporate the divorce mentality, that is, to incorporate, to welcome those who are represented by the situation of divorce in the first passage, and if the church will heed Jesus' invitation to welcome, be in solidarity with the children, then you and I and our church can be partners with God in moving toward the fuller manifestation of this realm.